Welcome to another summary sermon, this time on some of the minor prophets. Minor not because they are less important, but because they're shorter than the major prophets, that's all. And today we're going to have a look at Amos and Hosea. Here's the memory tool to help you remember what the book of Amos is all about. You can see a picture of a moose. So that obviously helps you to remember that it's about Amos. And this moose is holding up a plumb line. The plumb line, the main message of Amos is that God was asking the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, to evaluate their lives. Did they line up with God's law? And obviously the answer to that was no, and so God was therefore going to deal with them. The other prophet we're going to have a look at is this chap here. You can see this lady is made out of a hose, and so this must be the prophet Hosea. She's standing under a red light, and that therefore signifies that she must be a prostitute. The book of Hosea, very sad, because God asked the prophet Hosea to go out and marry a prostitute. And the lesson behind that is that he was actually saying, you know what, my bride, the nation of Israel, they're like a prostitute. Hosea, your wife, is sleeping with other men, and my nation is sleeping with other gods. Harsh message. Very, very harsh. One of the reasons I don't like preaching on the minor prophets is because they are so short. We only get the harsh part. There's not much of God's love and all the rest. It's just these harsh sermons. But let's dig into them anyway. And just before we are tempted to think that the message doesn't apply to us because we're now living in New Testament times, you know, what's this whole thing about, you know, God's nation being idolaters? We don't prostitute ourselves to other gods, do we? Well, James, in chapter 4, verse 4, in the New Testament, he says, you adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. To help us make sense of any book in the Bible really, but particularly the book of Hosea, we need to ask this question: what does God get? What does God get? In other words, what does this book tell me or teach me about God? And that's what we want to have a look at. First lesson, as we look at the children that Hosea had in his union, in his marriage with Gomer the prostitute, he had 3 children. And the lesson that we learn from looking at these 3 children, in particular the names that God instructed Hosea to name these children, we learn that God is gracious. God is gracious. The first child they had, God told him to name him Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is significant for 2 reasons. One, because the name means to sow or to scatter. And so that was what God was saying, is that if your lives don't line up with my plumb line, if you don't obey my laws, I'm going to scatter you. And that's exactly what happened to the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. God scattered them. He brought in the Assyrians, and they wiped them out and scattered them throughout the face of the earth. And the Jews only then started coming back to Jerusalem in about 1940, after the Second World War. And so that's the one major significance, but also because God said he was going to right the wrongs that were caused by Jehu, who killed King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, and there was a lot of bloodshed in a place called Jezreel, and God said he was going to sort out those wrongs. The second child they had, God told them to name this child Lo Ruhama, which means not loved. Now, every time this little girl would run around through the community and Hosea or Gomer would call her name, the people who heard Lo Ruhama would realize God doesn't love us anymore. Now, that's very, very harsh. God doesn't love us anymore. The third child they had, God told them to name this child Lo Ami, which means literally, you are not my people. In other words, you've broken the covenant with me. I was going to be your God. You were going to be my people. I was going to live with you. Now you're not my people because you are prostituting yourself to other gods. You might be sitting there thinking, but hang on, doesn't God's love, isn't that unconditional? Well, yes, it is. The expression of God's love is unconditional, but our enjoyment of that love is conditional, and it depends on our faith and our obedience. Now, the way we learn about God's grace is that before we get to the end of the book of Hosea, God turns these statements, the names, the prophecies of Hosea and Gomer's 3 children, the prophecies that their names preached, he turns those around. And he says, you know what, I'm no longer going to scatter. The time's going to come where I'm going to sow the nation of Israel back into the land. And the people who now are not loved, I'm going to love them again. And those people who once you were not my people, I'm going to change their name to Lo, or just to Ami, which means you are my people once again. And so even though they don't deserve it, God is going to turn everything around. That's his grace. When we look at Hosea's wife, Gomer, we learn that God is holy and that he cannot stand any kind of sin. And there's a number of sins that he points out through Gomer's life. It was a message that Hosea was preaching to the nation of Israel. The first thing they needed to learn is that they were idolaters. You know, they were worshipping Baal. And not only were they idolaters, but they were showing ingratitude towards God. And that's actually a sin. You know, they were taking the gifts that God had given them, and they were using that to worship the Baals. And they were worshiping at Asherah poles and Ashtaroth and all these funny gods. They were worshiping those gods with the gifts that God had given them, and they weren't giving thanks to God. And just a little thought in your life and mine, do we get tempted at times to think that the reason we are successful today is because of all the hard work that we've put in? You know, the reason I passed my exam so well is because I'm just such a clever person. If we are tempted to think along those lines, let me just put a stop to it right here. That is pride, which is sinful. We need to be grateful to God for what he has given us and enabled us to do. Don't be caught in the sin of ingratitude. And then the third sin that Hosea's wife Gomer depicts is one of hypocrisy, where she would be married to Hosea, but yet her heart would be pulled towards these other lovers. And God said the same thing was true of the nation of Israel, is that they would come to the temple to worship God, but then as soon as they left the temple, they would go and make sacrifices to Baal. And he says, no, that's just hypocrisy. Don't get caught in the same sin. Don't come to church on a Sunday or whenever it is that you go to church on a Friday or a Wednesday or whatever. Don't come to the church and then walk out and go and worship at the temple of the nearest shopping mall, where your real affection really lies. Jesus said this in the book of Matthew. We read this: you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. And so we learn from Gomer that God is holy. And from Hosea, we learn that God is love. I mean, you can read this passage for yourself in chapter 2. But the words used here are so tender. But then I will win her back once again. God takes the initiative of winning Israel back to himself. And of course, the climax of all of that is going to be when Jesus returns. I think the biggest lesson that you and I need to learn from all of this is that when we sin, we're not just breaking God's law. We're actually breaking his heart. You know, salvation is not like a legal thing that we do. You know, this is the part of the covenant, and so God will do this if I do that. This is way more. This is a relationship that we enter into with a loving God. And when we sin, we break his heart. may that cause us to draw near to him and far away from sin. May your life and mine be one where we strive to please the God who loves us.